All right, everybody, so this is going to be part 2 of our rubric creation tutorial. Now we're getting into performance level descriptions. So now that we have our criteria, we need to describe to our students what the criteria, not the criteria, but what the levels of performance in each criteria would be. What would be below the goal that we're trying to meet, what would actually be on target for the goal that we're trying to meet, and if needed, what would exceed that. And because you might have students that, again, as you're differentiating, might already have met the goal and you might want to push them to the next level. And so I can kind of show you really quickly too with the Common Core, at least in English, how that becomes a really nice and easy way to do that. But I'll save that towards the end when I add the exceeding piece. But let's just go through this. So again, I'm going to do another think aloud. I'm using the same standard that I used before, which is, we'll go back, right? So I'm going on standard 5 here. I'm trying to make sure that my students can analyze how an author structured their text to create mystery, tension, surprise. And if you go back to the supplemental reading and you go now to page 28, I've given you criteria on how to now guide you in creating the performance level descriptions. And they're right here. And I'm going to go again through my think aloud, through them one by one, walk you through it with examples, and hopefully that will make this clear so that you can do it on your own. So let's start with the first two. You want to make sure in your performance level criteria, which if I go back to my rubric are, again, these boxes, that they're descriptive and that they're clear. And so if I decided for my thesis statement, I'm going to come over here and say the thesis includes a student conclusion about the author, and that was what my performance level description was. That might not be very clear to my students because they might go, well, what's a conclusion? The thesis includes a student conclusion. What does that mean? So you want to make sure that the language, again, is understood between you and your students. The other thing is that as you think about descriptive, the performance is described in terms of what is observed or heard in the work. It might be harder to observe conclusion, right? And then especially if I do something like thesis is complete, what am I observing, right? Complete in what way? And so it's one of those pieces where you really have to be much more descriptive and much more clear. And so when I go, I might want to do something that's just simple for my students and simple for me, right? The thesis explains how the author of the text created mystery, tension, if I could spell, and, or, well, I could just say or, let's do that, or surprise. And maybe I do and or, right? Just because maybe there was more in that text, just depending on what my text is. Sorry, if I could spell it, that'd be helpful. So there is a performance level. That's what I'm looking for, right? And it's descriptive, it's clear. I've talked with my students about this throughout the unit. Because I've created this. This is a recommendation I give you is create these rubrics before you actually start the unit because you're trying to teach to the test. I know that sounds like, whoa, we don't teach the test. We do though, we teach to good tests. And if you have a clear vision in your mind and what you're trying to, get your students to, the teaching becomes a lot more rigorous and in line with that assessment. And so you've created this rubric, you know what you're looking for, and you've set that up, right? So now you want to make sure too that it covers the whole range of performance. So performance is described from one extreme of the continuum of quality to another for each criterion. And I'm going to go through all of these because I'm going to kind of mash them together. You also have to distinguish among levels. So performance descriptions are different enough from level to level that work can be categorized unambiguously. So not only does the performance level, like here's what is acceptable, that's what they mean by cover whole range of performance. Here's what's not acceptable or not meeting the standard. And in some cases, here's what goes above the standard. You have to be able to show that in your performance level descriptions. They also have to be distinguishable, right? So I can take work and say, yes, that absolutely matches this box, or that absolutely matches this box. So sometimes, and you'll see in the supplemental reading if you go through it, some people use either a top-down approach, which is what we're doing right now. I'm creating the rubric beforehand from my perspective to share with students. And then sometimes teachers might use a bottom-up approach and say, as they're going through this, they might tweak the rubric a little bit to make sure it is actually aligned with the assessment. There's some dangers in doing that for sure, but it definitely will help as you have more experience along the line to create stronger rubrics if you do a mixture of both. So you want to make sure, again, it covers the range and then it's distinguished between each box. You also want to center that target performance at the appropriate level, right? So I'm going to go back and go ahead and do that. Let me go over here. So because I want students to see in my rubric that this is where I want them to go, I might just do something like meets, right? Or meets standard, right? And then down here, I might be, this is below standard or below goal, right? And so we want to make sure that now my students recognize that's what we're trying to get to. And again, I'm not worried about grades yet. We're going to talk about that, in a couple of weeks on using rubrics and grading and all that other kind of stuff. But for today, we're just making sure we have very clear criteria for our assessments. So, so far now, okay, I've got performance that's described from one extreme to the other, which I'm about to do, right? It's distinguished among levels. That means in each criteria, I can actually match it to each box. I've centered the target performance at the appropriate level. Now, most importantly, like the language between each box needs to be similar. That's why I decided to wait for a minute so I can show you what I'm about to do. If you start describing like the boxes have completely different sentence structures, language, different words, it can start to get really confusing on like, well, what is the difference between this and this? So you want to make sure that as best as you can, that there's some parallel descriptions from level to level. So what does that mean? That means when I come over here, I might literally just copy this, put it in my below standard, and then tweak a few of, what is the standard or what is the goal that I'm looking for to highlight what wouldn't be that goal. So instead of rewriting it completely different. And so I might say something like the thesis does not, right? Just add that as my keywords. Something really simple. Does not explain, go there, how the author of the text created mystery, tension, and or surprise, right? And so now I've got a very clear descriptive criteria. It's, again, covers the whole range of performance, which in this case, if I go back, this is what I want for them to write a thesis that explains what I'm looking for. And this is what I don't want, right? And so it's very clear. And so if I see as I'm reading a paper and I'm like, yeah, this did it. They have a thesis and they explain that, that's meeting the standards. But if I look at it and I'm like, no, this thesis doesn't explain that, or at least it's vague or confusing or it's not quite there, then it's below standard. And it's pretty simple to match that to that box. So again, covers a whole range of performance, distinguished among levels. I've centered my targets area and it's got parallel language. So it becomes just a lot easier for my students to understand what my criteria, or the criteria that I have. So with that said, that is essentially how you create the performance level descriptions. Now I did say, what if I have students that go above and beyond? And so I'm going to go to my table design, or excuse me, table layout. I'm going to add one to the right. So now I have, oh, and that went off the page. That's okay. I'm not going to write in it per se. But if I go in the Common Core and I start to see like, okay, well, students can do this. The nice thing is then they're at grade level. They've met the goal. If I want them to go above that, maybe I look at the next grade level. Now they have to analyze how authors' choices concerning how to structure specific parts of a text contribute to its overall structure and meaning as well as its impact. So now we're not just talking about, specific effects. Now we're just talking about overall, like how does the author's structure of the text create certain effects and impacts and make it just an enjoyable reading experience. And so if they can already do those specific effects, maybe my next step for exceeding is that they were going beyond just like the mystery, tension, surprise and noticed other aspects that the author did with structure that created some impacts or effects that we haven't discussed per se, which again would be above grade level. That's just an example, but as you start thinking about your criterion, right, you want to make sure that most importantly, that you're clear on where you want them to be, what's the target, and what's below it. If you want to start branching out into what's above it, you can. You just have to be clear on what that is and follow those same principles. So, in a nutshell, that's how you write your performance description levels. If you have further questions, reach out to me, reach out to your PLC, and you should now be equipped and ready to create a rubric that highlights your criteria of what you're looking for in a constructive response or a performance task.